All right, everybody. Today's story is about a guy who spent 14 years building up a company's sales and training division from nothing. He was the top performer, the closer, the guy who turned walk-ins into repeat customers and new hires into competent employees. Then the company got bought out by a new owner who looked at the books and thought, I can do this cheaper. She tried to slash his pay to minimum wage on a 0 hours contract. When he refused, she fabricated gross misconduct charges. What she didn't count on was the fact that this man recorded every word of the disciplinary meeting, had an employment lawyer on speed dial, and knew more about labor law than she knew about the business she just bought. His replacement quit on day one. The company barely survived. And the settlement check? Let's just say it had a lot of zeros. Buckle up. The new owner tried to cut my pay to minimum wage after I'd built the business for 14 years. I recorded the meeting, hired a lawyer, and watched the company collapse without me. I want to share what happened to me because I think a lot of people in similar situations don't know their rights. And knowing your rights, as it turns out, is worth more than any pay raise. My name's Garrett. I'm 41. For 14 years, I worked as the senior training and sales coordinator for a mid-sized service company in the Midwest. I'll keep the details vague enough that nobody can identify the business. But think home improvement, residential services, the kind of company where customers call, someone shows up, does the work, and bills them. We had maybe 35 employees at our peak. I was one of the first 10. When I joined at 27, the company was small and rough around the edges. The owner, a guy named Walt, had started it out of his garage and grown it into a legitimate operation through sheer stubbornness and a good reputation. Walt was old school, handshake deals, no computers until I showed up and insisted. He hired me originally as a sales associate, but within a year I was doing everything. Training new hires, handling customer complaints, building the scheduling system, setting up our first real CRM, and closing the bigger accounts that Walt didn't have the patience for. Let me explain what I mean by built the business. When I started, the company did about $280,000 a year in revenue. By the time everything went down 14 years later, we were doing $1.6 million. Same service area, same general customer base, just better systems, better people, and better sales processes. I don't take all the credit. Walt was the foundation. But I was the framework. I built the training program that turned random hires into reliable service providers. I built the referral system that kept customers coming back. I built the upsell protocols that doubled our average ticket. And I did all of it while also being the company's top individual salesman for 11 of those 14 years. Walt appreciated me, in his way. He wasn't a hugger or a speech giver. He'd just nod and say, "Good work," and occasionally hand me a bonus check around the holidays. The bonuses weren't huge, $1,200, $1,500, but they were consistent, and I knew they came from a real place. Walt wasn't generous with everyone. He was generous with people who earned it. I should mention my wife, Danielle. She's been my rock through all of this. She works as an administrative coordinator at a dental practice. Between the two of us, we did fine. Not rich, not struggling. Mortgage on a 3-bedroom house, 1 car payment, a dog named Ringo, after the Beatle, not because he fetches rings, although he does fetch socks, which is close enough. We were comfortable. The kind of comfortable where you don't check your bank account before buying groceries, but you do check it before buying furniture. Anyway, about 2 years ago, Walt decided to sell. His health wasn't great, bad back, knee problems, the kind of accumulated wear from 30 years of physical work. He didn't have kids who wanted the business. He'd talked about it casually for years, and finally a buyer came along. The sale process took about 4 months. During that time, Walt pulled me aside one afternoon in the parking lot. It was one of those random moments where he'd linger by his truck like he had something to say, but didn't know how to start. He finally said, "Garrett, whoever buys this place, you're the reason it's worth buying. I hope they understand that." I said, "I hope so too." He said, "I told them about you. Told them you're the most important person in the building." I appreciated that. I still do. But telling someone about value and making them contractually obligated to respect it are two very different things. Walt did one. He should have done both. The buyer was a woman I'll call Margot. Margot came from a completely different industry. She'd been in retail management, running a chain of home goods stores that had been bought out by a larger company. She got a payout from that deal, and decided to invest in a local service business. Her words. She saw our revenue numbers and our customer retention rate and thought she was buying a turnkey operation. What she didn't understand, what she never bothered to learn, was that those numbers were me, not the brand, not the location, not the equipment. Me, my systems, my relationships, my training programs, my sales approach. Take me out, and the whole thing was just a guy with a truck and a phone number. Walt introduced me to Margot during the transition period. I shook her hand, showed her around, explained the operation. She nodded along and took notes on an iPad. She asked how many units we moved per quarter. I said, we don't really think of it that way. We have about 400 active customer accounts, and our average annual revenue per account is about $4,000. She looked at me like I'd spoken a different language. She said, so we're not tracking unit velocity? I said, we're tracking happy customers who keep calling us back. She made a note on her iPad and didn't ask me another question that day. Hold on. For the listeners, this is me jumping in. I want to make sure you're catching the red flags here, because Garrett might be too close to see them. Unit velocity. This woman asked about unit velocity at a home services company. That's like asking a plumber about his fluid optimization metrics. Margot came from retail, where everything is widgets and throughput. She's about to run a relationship-based service business using a home goods playbook. I'm calling her Discount Margot because she's about to discount the only valuable thing in this company, the guy standing in front of her, and mark up everything else. This is going to be beautiful and painful. Probably more painful for Margot. The first 6 months under Margot's ownership were a slow descent. She didn't make big changes immediately. I think she was observing, or maybe she was just figuring out what she'd bought. But there were signs. She raised prices by 15% across the board without asking anyone who dealt with customers whether that was a good idea. It wasn't. We lost about 30 accounts in the first quarter. Customers who'd been with us for years called me personally to say they were going elsewhere. I couldn't blame them. I would have done the same thing. She cut the holiday bonuses. Not reduced, cut. 0. For everyone. She said the company needed to redirect resources toward growth initiatives. I asked what the growth initiatives were. She said she was still developing the strategy. No bonuses and no strategy. Just a vague promise and a tighter budget. She stopped approving the materials I'd been using for training. I had a whole onboarding system, binders, checklists, video walkthroughs I'd recorded on my phone, that I gave every new hire. Margot said the training materials looked unprofessional and that she was going to hire someone to create branded onboarding content. That someone never materialized. So new hires got nothing, and the quality of work started slipping. She also restructured the scheduling system I'd spent years building. I had a rotation that balanced workload, travel time, and customer preference. Some customers specifically requested certain technicians. Margot replaced it with a first available model that dispatched whoever was closest geographically, regardless of skill level or customer relationship. Within a month, we had 2 situations where a junior tech was sent to a complex job they weren't qualified for. Both resulted in callbacks. One resulted in a refund. The customer, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been with us 9 years, called me personally and said, "Garrett, what happened? That was not the service I'm used to." I apologized and said we were going through changes. She said, "Changes aren't supposed to make things worse." I started keeping a personal log around this time. Not for legal purposes, not yet. Just for my own sanity. A Google Doc where I'd write down what happened each day. Prices raised, bonuses cut, training canceled, scheduling broken, quality slipping. I called it the descent. Danielle read some of it one night and said, "Garrett, this reads like a horror story." I said, "It is one. I'm just living in it." Through all of this, I kept doing my job. I kept closing sales. I kept training the guys who needed it, using my own materials, on my own time. I kept the referral system running. I kept customer relationships alive. And every month, the numbers stayed relatively stable. Not because of anything Margot did, but in spite of everything she did. I want to mention one thing that happened during this period that still makes me shake my head. Margot held a team-building event about 3 months after she took over. She rented a conference room at a hotel, spent about 2 grand on it, and made the entire staff sit through a 4-hour presentation about company vision and values. She had slides. She had a mission statement she'd written. She had a quote from some business guru on every other page. At one point, she said, "Our competitive advantage isn't what we do. It's how we do it." And I thought, no. Our competitive advantage is relationships. It's the fact that when Mrs. Patterson calls, she gets me. When Mr. Volkov has an emergency, I pick up the phone. When a new hire doesn't know how to handle a tricky situation, I walk them through it. That's not a mission statement. That's just showing up. But you can't put "just show up" on a PowerPoint slide, I guess. During the lunch break at the team building event, one of the senior techs, a guy named Phil, who'd been with us almost as long as me, pulled me aside in the hallway and said, "Garrett, is she for real?" I said, "I think so, Phil." He said, "We're in trouble, aren't we?" I said, "Yeah, I think we might be." Phil quit about a month after I did. He opened his own one-man operation out of his garage. He's doing fine. I send him referrals when I can. Then she came for my paycheck. It was a Tuesday morning. She called me into the back office, the same office where Walt used to hand me bonus checks, and told me she'd been reviewing the compensation structure and determined that my salary was not aligned with industry benchmarks. She said the company was transitioning to performance-based flexible contracts and that my new arrangement would be minimum wage base with commission on completed projects on a 0 hours contract. No guaranteed hours, no guaranteed income, no benefits. I'd been making $52,000 a year with benefits. She was offering me minimum wage, $8.70 an hour at the time, with the theoretical possibility of commission. For a guy who'd been there 14 years and was responsible for 60% of the company's revenue. I said no. Obviously. She said, "Garrett, this is the direction the company is going. If you're not on board, we may need to explore other options." I said, "What other options?" She said, "I think you know." I want to pause here and describe what was happening in my body during this conversation. My hands were flat on my thighs under the desk. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. There was this roaring in my ears. Not anger exactly, more like a pressure buildup. 14 years. I'd given 14 years of my life to this company. I'd missed Danielle's birthday dinner once because a customer had an emergency. I'd come in on a Saturday to train a new hire who needed extra help. I'd spent my own money on gas driving to jobs when the company truck was in the shop because I didn't want to cancel on a customer. And now this woman, who'd owned the business for 6 months and couldn't tell me what half our services cost without checking her iPad, was sitting across from me offering minimum wage. Like I was some kid applying at a fast food place. Like 14 years was worth $8.70 an hour. I didn't say any of that. I said, "I'll need some time to think about it." She said, "Don't take too long." I left the office, went to my truck, and sat there for about 20 minutes with the engine running and my forehead on the steering wheel. Then I drove home and called Danielle. She listened to everything and said, "Garrett, do not take that deal. We will figure this out." That's when I knew it was going to be okay. Whatever happened, it was going to be okay. Pause. I need everyone to sit with this for a second. Discount Margot just tried to cut a 14-year veteran's salary from $52,000 to minimum wage on a 0 hours contract. That's not a pay cut. That's economic eviction. She wants to turn the guy who built the business into an Uber driver for his own company. Performance-based flexible contract. That's corporate for, I want you to work for free unless you personally generate enough profit to justify feeding yourself. And the veiled threat? We may need to explore other options? Lady, the only option you should be exploring is a mirror, because the person you're about to lose is the only reason your investment isn't worthless. This has big Fire Festival energy, all ambition, no infrastructure, and someone's about to get stranded on a beach with no food. 2 weeks later, I was called into a formal disciplinary meeting. Margot, her part-time HR consultant, a woman from an agency who clearly didn't want to be there, and me. The charge, gross misconduct. Specifically, Margot claimed that I had been using unauthorized methods to deliver services and that several customer complaints had been filed about work quality. Now, I want to be very clear about something. There were no customer complaints about my work. I asked to see the complaints. Margot said they were verbal and not documented. I asked which customers complained. She said she wasn't at liberty to disclose. I asked the HR consultant if this was standard procedure. The HR consultant looked at her notes and said, "Typically, documented evidence is required for a gross misconduct charge." Margot moved on. She said that regardless, my attitude and resistance to structural changes were creating a hostile work environment. I had literally never raised my voice to anyone in that building. I'd never sent a hostile email. I'd never refused a task. My resistance was saying no to a 90% pay cut. That was the hostile part, apparently. Here's where it gets interesting. Before the meeting, I did something that might have saved my financial future. I checked the recording laws in my state. We're a one-party consent state, which means I only need my own permission to record a conversation I'm part of. So I turned on the voice memo app on my phone before walking into that meeting, and I recorded every single word. Margot spent about 20 minutes building her case, if you can call it that. The unauthorized methods turned out to be me using my own training materials instead of the branded ones she never created. The customer complaints had no names, no dates, no documentation. The hostile work environment was me disagreeing with her compensation proposal. It was embarrassing, honestly. Not for me, for her. Even the HR consultant was shifting in her chair. At the end, Margot gave me two options. Accept the new compensation structure, minimum wage, 0 hours, commission only, or accept termination for gross misconduct with no severance. I said, I'd like to think about it overnight. She said, take the weekend. I took the weekend. And I spent every hour of it on the phone with an employment attorney named Pete, who my neighbor had recommended. Pete listened to the recording, reviewed my employment history, and said, and I'm quoting here, "Garrett, this woman just handed you a case on a silver platter. Wait. He recorded it. This man walked into a rigged disciplinary meeting with his phone recording in his pocket like he was wearing a wire in a mob movie. Discount Margot thought she was setting up a termination. She was actually recording her own blooper reel. No documented complaints, no evidence, no nothing. Just a woman with an iPad and a grudge trying to push out the best employee she'll ever have because he wouldn't accept a pay structure designed for a summer intern. Pete the lawyer just heard this recording and said, silver platter. I'm telling you, when lawyers get excited, that's when you know the other side messed up bad. This is about to cost Margot more than she budgeted. Way more. That weekend was one of the most productive weekends of my life. Pete and I talked for a total of about 4 hours across Saturday and Sunday. He listened to the full recording twice. He pulled up my employment contract, which, thank God, I'd kept a copy of in my files at home. He reviewed the company's employee handbook, which Margot hadn't changed from Walt's original version. And here's the kicker. The handbook explicitly stated that disciplinary action for gross misconduct required documented evidence of the misconduct, including dates, descriptions, and corroborating statements. Margot had none of that. Zero. She'd fired a gun with no bullets, and Pete was about to show her the empty chamber. Pete also pointed out something I hadn't considered. The recording captured Margot admitting that the unauthorized methods I was charged with were, in her own words, materials you created yourself. She literally acknowledged that I created the training system and then tried to fire me for using it. Pete said, that's not misconduct, that's initiative, and she just admitted on tape that she knows it. Danielle and I sat at the kitchen table Sunday night and she said, so what's the plan? I said, I go in Monday and I don't accept anything. Pete handles the rest. She nodded and said, good. And Garrett, no matter what happens, we're fine. We've always been fine. That's Danielle, steady as a rock when I need her to be. I came back Monday and told Margot I would not accept either option. I presented her with a letter from Pete outlining my rights under employment law, specifically that terminating a 14-year employee for fabricated gross misconduct without documentation constituted constructive dismissal and potential wrongful termination. The letter also mentioned the recording. Margot went pale. And I mean pale, like someone had turned her brightness setting down to about 30%. She asked when I'd recorded the meeting. I said, during the meeting. One-party consent state. She said, you can't do that. I said, Pete says I can. Call him if you'd like. She did not call Pete. She looked at her HR consultant. The HR consultant was studying her notes with the intensity of someone trying to teleport out of the room. Nobody spoke for about 8 seconds. 8 seconds doesn't sound long. In a conference room with a termination letter on the table and a recording on the other side of it, 8 seconds feels like 8 hours. Margot finally said, "I'll need to consult with my legal team." I said, "Of course. Pete's number is on the letter." I stood up, shook both their hands because I'm not an animal, and walked out. What followed was about 3 weeks of negotiations conducted entirely through lawyers. Margot's attorney, who I suspect told her she was in a bad position, pushed for a quiet settlement. Pete pushed for full remedy. In the end, we settled on a separation package that included 12 weeks of paid notice, at my current salary, not minimum wage, full payout of accrued benefits and unused vacation, a neutral reference letter, and a confidential settlement figure that I can't disclose, but I will say this. It had 5 digits, and the first one wasn't a 1. Or a 2. I worked through my notice period professionally. Did my job. Trained nobody because there was nobody to train. Margot hadn't hired a replacement. She seemed to think the other employees would absorb my responsibilities. The other employees were service technicians. They fix things. They don't sell things or train people or manage 400 customer accounts. During my notice period, something unexpected happened. Several of our longtime customers found out I was leaving. Not from me, from the technicians who mentioned it on jobs. They started calling, not to complain about the company, to thank me. Mr. Volkov, who owned a row of rental properties we'd serviced for 8 years, called and said, "Garrett, you always picked up the phone. That mattered." Mrs. DeLuca, who I'd helped through an emergency repair on Christmas Eve 6 years ago, her furnace died at 11 p.m. I drove out personally with a space heater while we arranged a fix for the next morning. Sent me a card. It said, "Some people just show up. You always showed up." I'm not gonna lie, I teared up at that one. Danielle found me reading it at the kitchen counter and didn't say anything. She just stood next to me for a minute and then went back to whatever she was doing. That's love. Not big gestures. Just standing next to someone when they're feeling something. One customer, a guy named Hank, who ran a small restaurant and had been with us since year 2, did something I still can't believe. He called me and asked if I needed a job reference. I said I appreciated it, but I was a vendor, not an employee of his. He said, "I don't care. You want me to write a letter saying Garrett is the most reliable person I've ever worked with in any capacity? Because I will. I'll write it right now." He sent me the letter the next day. 2 pages. I keep it in my desk drawer. On my last day, a young guy named Drew, one of the techs I'd trained personally about 3 years earlier, shook my hand in the parking lot and said, "Garrett, this place is going to fall apart without you." I said, "I know, Drew. Take care of yourself." He said, "I already put in my notice. I'm coming to find you wherever you end up." And he did. 2 months later, Drew called me and asked if I knew of any openings. I got him a job at a competitor who I'd known for years. He's doing great. Sent me a photo last week of a job he completed. Big smile, clean work, happy customer in the background. I showed Danielle and she said, "You taught him that." And yeah, I did. That's the thing about training people, right? It lasts longer than any company. Longer than any boss. Longer than any 5-minute email policy. Yo, Drew quit in solidarity. That's not just loyalty, that's a review. When your employees follow you out the door, that's a 5-star Glassdoor review written in real time. And Discount Margot is sitting in an empty office wondering where her unit velocity went. I'll tell you where it went. It drove home in Garrett's truck along with 14 years of sales relationships, training knowledge, and customer trust. You can't buy that at a home goods clearance sale. Margot paid for a business and got a building. The business walked out the door, got in a pickup, and drove to a lawyer's office. That's not a transaction gone wrong. That's a transaction that was never going to work because you can't own what you don't understand. What happened after I left was predictable but still kind of wild to watch from the outside. Within the first month, revenue dropped by about 40%. My customer account started calling and getting Margot, who they didn't know and didn't trust. Several of them called me directly. They had my cell from years of working together and asked where I'd gone. I told them I'd left the company and wished them well. I didn't poach. I didn't need to. About 20 of them left on their own within 3 months. Margot's replacement for me was herself. She tried to handle sales and training while also running the business. She sent mass emails to our customer list, something I'd specifically never done because it felt impersonal, and our customers valued the personal touch. The mass emails had typos. Multiple customers told me about them. One guy, a regular named Bill, who'd been with us for 11 years, forwarded me the email and said, "Is this a joke?" It was not a joke. It was just bad. The training gap was even worse. New hires who came in after me had no onboarding system, no training materials, no mentor. One of them showed up to a customer's house and didn't know how to use the equipment. The customer called Margot. Margot apparently blamed the employee. The employee quit the next day. I heard Margot went through 4 new hires in 3 months. None lasted more than 6 weeks. About 5 months after I left, I heard through Drew that Margot was trying to sell the company. She'd listed it with a business broker at about 70% of what she'd paid for it. The broker told her the valuation was low because the key revenue-generating personnel had departed and the customer base had significantly eroded. I imagine that was a fun conversation. I also heard, through Hank, the restaurant owner who wrote me the reference letter, that Margot tried to reactivate some of the customer accounts that had gone dormant after I left. She sent personal letters to about 50 former customers, offering a loyalty discount to come back. 3 people responded, 3 out of 50. And 2 of those 3 called me afterward asking if the company was desperate. I said I couldn't comment. But yes, they were desperate. The business broker apparently told Margot that the company's value had declined by about 60% since she'd purchased it, 60% in less than a year. The revenue that Walt and I had built over 14 years was evaporating in real time because the one person who knew how to generate it was gone. And Margot's response? She listed the company for sale and started looking at other investment opportunities. I heard she's interested in a laundromat chain now. I genuinely wish those laundromats well. Last I checked, the listing was still active. Nobody's buying. Turns out a service company without its service people and its customer relationships is just a phone number and some used equipment. Who could have predicted that? Oh, one more thing. Remember Walt, the original owner? He called me about a month after I left. He'd heard what happened. He said, "Garrett, I should have put something in the sale agreement about keeping you on. That was my mistake." I told him it wasn't his fault. He said, "Maybe not, but I knew what you were worth. And I should have made sure the next person knew too." Then he said, "If you ever want to start your own thing, I'll back you." I haven't taken him up on it yet, but I think about it. I ran into one of Margot's failed new hires at a gas station about 2 months after I left. Young kid, maybe 23. He recognized me from the one day of training he'd gotten before I left, which was basically me showing him around for an hour. He said, "Hey, you're the guy who used to run things, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Dude, I lasted 11 days. She had me going to jobs with no instructions and no support. On day 8, I showed up to a customer's house, and the guy said, 'Do you even know what you're doing?' And I had to say no. I called the office and nobody answered. I quit the next morning." He didn't seem bitter, just confused, like he'd wandered into someone else's bad dream. Danielle and I are doing well. The settlement money paid off the car and padded our savings. I'm currently working as a sales consultant for a larger company in a similar industry. Better hours, better pay, actual benefits. Ringo still fetches socks. We took him to the lake last weekend. First real outing we've done in months. He swam for about 3 hours straight and then slept the entire drive home. Danielle took a photo of him passed out in the back seat with his tongue hanging out and sent it to her sister with the caption, "Mood." I love that dog. I love that woman. And I love that we're past this. Honestly, the whole experience changed how I think about work. I used to believe that loyalty was its own reward. That if you showed up, did your best, and built something real, the people in charge would see it and protect it. That's naive. The people in charge change. The new people don't know what you built. They just see a line item on a spreadsheet and think, "I can get this cheaper." You can't. But they don't know that until you're gone. Life goes on. Final update. Pete the lawyer sent me a message last week. He said, Garrett, I use your recording in consultations now. Not the actual audio. I describe the scenario. It's my go-to example for how not to conduct a disciplinary meeting. I told him I was glad my pain could be educational. Danielle says I should write a book about what happened. I told her nobody wants to read about employment law. She said, people want to read about a guy who stood up for himself. That's not employment law. That's just a good story. She might be right. She usually is. For anyone in a similar situation, here's my advice. Know your state's recording laws. Document everything. Keep copies of your work on your own devices when the company won't provide them. And never, ever accept a pay cut just because someone new walks in with an iPad and an attitude. You built what you built. That has value. Don't let anyone discount it. Would you have taken the minimum wage deal to keep the job? Or would you have done what I did? Curious what you guys think. Also, anyone know a good title for a book about getting fired by someone who doesn't understand what they bought? Asking for a friend. Here's the thing about Garrett. He didn't burn anything down. He didn't steal clients. He didn't even badmouth Margot. He just knew his rights, documented the truth, and let the consequences play out naturally. Discount Margot thought she was cutting costs. She was cutting the engine. And now she's trying to sell a car with no motor. 14 years of work, 1 recording, and a 5-digit check later. Garrett's doing better than ever, and the company can't give itself away. That's not revenge. That's just gravity. Drop a comment. Would you have recorded that meeting? Subscribe and I'll see you next time. Subscribe and I'll see you next time. Subscribe and I'll see you next time. Subscribe and I'll see you next time.